Hey everybody, it's Guy again from TDI, and we are going to shoot a quick video today on creative financing. We get a lot of questions about how some of our deals are structured and how and what creative financing is, and we figured we'd just give a little bit of a rundown on some of the key points that make our deals creative, and hopefully it adds some value to your real estate investing. So without further ado, who would use creative financing structures? Answer is anyone who can't or doesn't want to use conventional financing. That's pretty much outside of the norm of all conventional rules, outside of interest rates, outside of loan structures, outside of who's lending the money, those kinds of things. What is creative financing? Creative financing is typically a deal that uses unconventional terms and conditions to execute a deal. Pretty straightforward, right? When would you use creative financing is typically when you or the property don't qualify for conventional lending. This is obviously for many factors, but if you don't qualify, of course, you can work outside of the box of the banks, but you're into the creative structure. More importantly, the properties don't always qualify. And that means that you've got to find somebody who's going to lend on it. Again, it's going to be unconventional lending, and we'll get into that here in a sec. Where can you do creative financing? Every single deal. It's typically from a vendor or a seller, but everybody misses one very, very important factor in all of the things that come from a real estate deal, and it's forgetting to ask. You might go into the most conventional deal and just expect the most conventional rules and terms and conditions. But if you don't ask the question, you're never going to find out what a vendor or a seller is willing to do. And that's where we've started to change our approach over the last few years is we ask those questions first. Because if they're there on the table, you want to know so that you can build them into the deal, you can build them into the structure, you can let the lenders know, you can let the partners know, and your due diligence and your process can vary greatly depending on what kind of terms and conditions you're able to negotiate in the deal. So don't forget, always ask, is there some creative financing options that a vendor is willing to do? And typically, and most of the time I should say, the people in the middle, i.e. the agents, they usually don't know much about the creative financing world. So if you ask them, a lot of the times you're just going to hear no because they don't even understand what you're asking. But if you tell them, because they work for you, you instruct them to ask the seller or the vendor those questions, you will immediately know whether or not the vendor or the seller knows what they're talking about, because usually if they do, they're going to respond with more questions of what are you looking for and what kind of a structure are you thinking. And then as soon as you start getting those questions in return, you know you've got an opportunity there to get a bit more of a creative deal. Why would you use creative financing? Well, there's typically only a very few number of reasons. Number one is it's a distressed property. That just means that it's so bad that the lenders won't go in there, or it won't hit the appraisal, or there's a ton of work to do. Maybe it's been left for a long time. All of these reasons could make it difficult for a vendor to sell their property, and that's typically when they're going to start being more flexible. Price being too high, that's a given. I mean, if they're asking way more than people are willing to pay or a bank is willing to lend on, then typically in order to get that price that they're asking for, they've got to think outside the box and start to offer more unconventional terms and conditions to make it more attractive. Remote locations is a big one. Banks really like to be in epicenters. They like to be close to the big population. They want to be close to schools and hospitals, and they want a minimum population. Typically, they're looking for a minimum population of around 100,000. So you start to get in those tertiary markets that just don't have that sort of population support, then you get less and less lenders that'll lend to you. So a lot of the times, the creative deals are going to be found in those tertiary markets, but that doesn't mean they're not available right next door, because they usually are as well. If you have no cash, low or no cash, if you're buying $1 million property and you only have $100,000, that means you need 90% financing. There's not a lot of banks out there that are going to give you 90% financing. So you either have to go get a partner, or you can approach the vendor and ask them if they're willing to give you the 90% financing. Too long on the market. So that just ties into distressed property. But if you find a property that has been on the market for too long, there's a reason. And a lot of the times that's when you're going to start to ask the questions to the vendor of what they're willing to do to sell their property. Like, hey, notice it's been on here for a year. What are you willing to do about it? How do you get creative financing done, or how do you structure creative financing deals? These are a lot of the ways, but seller financing is typically the biggest one. Seller financing or a vendor take back. Seller financing is more if the seller is going to do the financing for you, where there's no other lenders involved. They're typically in a first position. It's kind of my opinion of it anyway. A vendor take back is when they're going to take back a certain portion of the mortgage. So in $1 million purchase, maybe you get a bank that's only willing to give you 600 grand. And in the same scenario where you only have 100, that means you need to bridge a $300,000 gap between your first lender and you, which could be the vendor. You could say, hey, look, the bank's only willing to give me 600 grand. I have 100. Would you be willing to finance 300,000 of it? That's a vendor take back. Extended closings are another very creative way to sort of push out the dates that give you more flexibility and options to go get lending and get the deal structured. And sometimes I do extended closings, for 2 years, which are well past any date most banks are going to give you or like to give you, because that gives you the time to do the work to the property. Cashback rebate, very simple. Cashback at closing, you can get some of that negotiated into the deal. A lease option is typically where you're leasing, making a payment, and you have an option at a certain given point to purchase that back from the vendor down the road. A rent to own is pretty much the same thing, just structured a little differently. And then an option to purchase. An option to purchase can be registered on any title, which doesn't necessarily mean you have any other obligations other than you just register an option, and that could be for many, many reasons. So at the end of the day, there's a ton of creative financing options, but we at TDI really like to focus on the creative options first, just to see if they're available, because we've been able to negotiate some fantastic terms and conditions in a deal when we wouldn't have otherwise expected it. And all that does is put more money and more return in our investors' pockets. So you always got to be willing to ask these questions right up front, because you never know what you're going to get. A lot of information here, and if you want to know more, you can click on the link, go see another video, or you can check out topdowninvestments.com. We'll see you there.